today we are talking about getting correct exposure while you're in the field. So a lot of people ask me about my camera settings and how I get the images that I get from my Sony FX3. And a lot of it comes down to me making sure that I have the correct exposure so that when I go into post, everything is kind of coming from how I shot out in the field. And so today I wanted to share with you all 4 exposure tools that's going to allow you to get accurate exposure on set so that when you do go into post to color grade or color correct, everything looks exactly how you want it and you're getting the results that you really want. So let's get into it. So before we get into the 4 exposure tools, I want to explain what IRE is because you're going to hear this a lot as I talk about these tools. So IRE stands for the Institute of Radio Engineers, and it is used to determine the brightness levels of a video signal. So that's why whenever we talk about these exposure tools, you might hear somebody say 50% IRE or 70% IRE. So as I talk about this and you go along, that is what IRE means. It's just a percentage or a number used to determine your brightness level. So with that, let's get into the first exposure tool, false color. False color is a tool that uses different assigned colors to represent IRE values to determine your exposure. So the reason why I say that this is the fastest and easiest because the minute that you turn false color on, you're going to get a plethora of colors and you're going to get this sidebar that tells you where you are on the scale from 0 to 100. Now, if you're from 0 to 10 or 0 to 15, you're between the purple and the blue, which is going to mean that you may be clipping your blacks and you won't be able to retain that information in post. If you're between 90 to 100, that means that you're going to be clipping your whites and you won't be able to bring down and retain your highlights in post. Now, the middle gray card, which is the 18% gray card, is between 48 to 52 IRE. And normally with skin tones, you want to be between 42 to 70. Here's why. For darker skin tones, you want to be between 42 and 58. That's pretty much between your green and your pink. That lets you know that you have really good exposure on the skin, darker skin. Someone who may be lighter or going more towards the white route, then you want to be between 60 and 70% IRE. Again, these colors all represent something, and so being able to see them all at once lets you know what your shadows are looking like, what your highlights are looking like, and what your midtones, i.e., the skin tones, are looking like. This is why it's one of my favorite exposure tools that allows you to easily read your brightness, your exposure, as well as skin tones. The second exposure tool is going to be your zebras. Now, zebras are a little similar to false color, as in it allows you to see your brightness and when you're overexposed on an image, but it doesn't give you as much information that you will get with false color. So zebras could be a little confusing, so this is kind of how I was able to understand it, but let's define what zebras is first. Zebras are striped overlays that help indicate overexposed parts of your image. Generally, camera IRE levels range from 60 to 100% and can be set as per the brightness level you need. So, for example, with my Sony FX3, I have a couple options when it comes to zebras. I can go from 60 to 100 or over, and I have 2 options for custom. I can do a lower limit or I can do a standard range. So the way that I look at it, the lower limit helps determine my brightness and it lets me know if I'm overexposed. And if I want really good correct exposure, for instance with my skin tone, I might use standard range. To check the correct exposure, set a standard value and range for the brightness level. The zebra pattern will appear in areas that fall within the range that you set. To check for overexposure, set a minimum value for the brightness level. The zebra pattern will appear over areas with a brightness level equal to or higher than the value you set. So again, for me, lower limit is what I'm going to use to check my highlights to make sure that I'm not overexposed. And if I want to use zebras to have correct exposure or check my skin tones, then I'm going to use the standard range. Standard range allows you to go lower than 60% IRE, while lower limit starts off normally around 60 or 70 and goes to 100 or a little above. But of course you have to play around with it It all just goes off of what it is that you like when you are trying to correct your exposure and who and the color of the person it is that you're shooting or whatever the object is that you're shooting. The third exposure tool is going to be your waveforms. Now, when I used to use the C200 only had waveforms embedded in the camera, and just like the Sony FX3, it only has histogram and zebras. And then when you get into your Blackmagics and things like that, you may get false color. So again, it really all of this depends on what camera that you have. But if you have an external monitor, you can pretty much access all of these exposure tools at once, which is why I always recommend having it external monitor such as Small HD, because I think Small HD has the most accurate colors when it comes to a monitor, and that is extremely important when you're trying to get correct exposure. If you don't have a monitor that is giving you accurate readings of your colors and things of that nature, your brightness and such, then it doesn't really matter to have an external monitor. But when it comes to waveforms, waveforms help you check the brightness on an IRE scale from 0 to 100 vertically. 0 means that you're clipping your blacks, and 100 means that you're clipping your whites. And then you may see a little movement in the middle, which is pretty much your midtones, and that is going to be whatever your subject is. And again, you want to make sure that you're in the standard IRE when it comes to that. The whole point of the waveform is to physically match the screen from left to right to let you know what areas in your image are peaking with highlights and what are peaking with your shadows, and where you might need to maneuver or change for the correct exposure. Now, you can get 3 different types of graphs when it comes to waveforms. You have your Luma, your RGB, and your RGB Parade. The RGB lets you know per color where you are when it comes to your highlights, your shadows, and your midtones, to make sure again that you're not peaking with the individual colors. And the last exposure tool that you can use is going to be histogram. Now, every camera probably has histogram more than they have waveform or false color. So you can start using your histogram with whatever camera you have, start using your zebras with whatever camera you have. But histograms gives you a quick glimpse at exposure values of your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights across your image. So just like your waveforms went vertical from 0 to 100, your histograms are going to go more horizontal and vertical. Horizontal being 0 from the left to 100 on the right. 0 being the shadows to 100 being your pure whites. The horizontal axis is going to measure your luminance, while the vertical axis shows the number of pixels at a specific value. If the majority of the graph is to the left, that means that you're underexposed, and if majority of the graph is to the right, that means that you may be overexposed. You kind of want to try to make sure that you have more of everything in the middle, and that kind of gives you a more correct exposure. The RGB histogram is going to show you the histograms of each color individually. Your red, your greens, and your blues. By checking the image's RGB's histogram, you can see the color saturation, the white balance, as well as the contrast more accurately. And all of these tools work together to give you accurate and correct exposure while you're out in the field. Again, I suggest getting a monitor so that you can have all of these assets with you wherever you are, because a lot of these cameras that are hybrid or mirrorless cameras, you don't get access to these exposure tools, and it's extremely important as you start to learn how to get really good exposure to have these tools handy. So make sure that you're learning these tools. I promise you, they're gonna make your images and what you're shooting and what you're creating and your content so much better when everything is exposed correctly. Now, all of this is subjective because it depends on what you like. Some people may like darker things, some people may like lighter things, some people may like more contrast, some people may like more saturation. It really depends on what you like, but the rule of it all is to just make sure that you're not completely underexposed or completely overexposed. So hopefully this video helped you all. I realized as I was researching that this could be a information overload, and it's a lot of information and it can get very confusing. I was getting confused myself. However, I think at the end of the day, all of these tools are just really here to help you get correct exposure, and it's up to you to find the tools that work more for you. Some of my friends like zebras over false color. I like false colors over all of them. Some people like waveforms a little bit more, It really just depends on what works for your workflow. And I just wanted to be able to provide options for you because I feel like this is important. And when a lot of people ask me about my images and my content, it's not necessarily just the color grading in the post. It's how I was able to dial in and get correct settings and exposure in the field to make sure that when I am in post, everything comes out right. So hopefully this helped you all. Leave a sun, that's the icon for this video. Leave a sun in the comments below. If you have any questions, leave them below as well. Let me know your thoughts. If you have information to share with me about the topic, let me know as well. And thank y'all so much for watching. Make sure you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.